Hello and welcome everyone to the Solo Multimedia Podcast, where I give you my unfiltered takes straight off the cuff. And today I'm going to be talking about the new Petrol Girls record, Baby. So obviously I'm a bit late to the party on this one, but it's kind of odd to see this record get so much attention, I guess, because essentially Petrol Girls have been like a local band to where I am, which is London, for a while, and they've always been a band that I've kind of been aware of, and I think the record before this one I actually thought was really good. That was kind of the first one I heard from them and was like, okay, this is actually like some pretty solid kind of like very almost like punk energy alt rock type stuff, I suppose. The biggest comparison I could make, and it's definitely still the case on this record, but to the last one more so, is I actually thought it sounded like a early but more punky and slightly less math rocky Biffy Clyro. Which was kind of an interesting, comparison point, because they feel like in a lot of ways such different bands now, especially now that Biffy are so kind of, such a huge band that essentially are stadium or arena rock or whatever you want to call it, even though they did have at the start kind of like a lot of post-hardcore and punk rock roots, but that's neither here nor there really. But yeah, the last record I thought was decent from these guys. I've seen them a decent number of times too, and they've always been good live. I actually saw them supporting La Dispute a couple years ago. That was like the first time I saw them, and I thought they were really good. That was again directly after the last record, Cut and Stitch. So with them being kind of like a local band that I see supporting other not huge bands in like relatively small venues, it was definitely a bit of a shock to see Fantano somehow managed to find them. But I was actually really glad that he gave them a shout out, because I definitely think this record deserves it. Not to spoil my opinion or anything, I think this record's really, really great. I definitely understand what he saw in it. Basically, for anyone who isn't familiar with the band, they're a 4-piece rock band. They're very like stripped back in terms of any, like, there's nothing too flashy about them. They just play their instruments really well with a lot of personality in the vocals. Like I said, they kind of mix I guess you could say punk rock and alt rock with maybe like bits of, I don't know if I would say math rock exactly, but the guitars can sometimes play kind of like more noodly lines that sound a little bit like something inspired from that world. And that's definitely still the case on this record, even though this one takes it in a direction I'm actually a huge fan of. One big difference on this record is the production is a lot grittier, but it still sounds like quite organic and punchy. And it just works so well for them, because the alt rock sections and all the huge choruses and whatnot need that kind of clarity and punch to really cut through to get its point across, but the punkier sections still benefit from having like a lot of distortion and a lot of kind of like noise backing it, which it just works really well from a production level. And also I feel like the songwriting on this record has stepped up quite a lot. Like all of the tracks off Cut and Stitch were definitely solid. Like I didn't have too many major like low points on that record, but it definitely lived on its highlights, I feel like. But this record feels incredibly consistent front to back. It all has a very clear vibe, aesthetic, lyrical message. It just feels very, very cohesive. And again, incredibly impactful. But just to go through the track listing, the record opens with Scraps. It's just like a short kind of like not even instrumental, it's like a short kind of like I guess soundscape to intro the actual first song, which is Preachers. Right off the bat, you can tell that they have brought some new things to the table on this one. So it opens with like a pretty neat little noodly math rock inspired riff, which is what you would expect to hear off the previous one. But the second the like bass and drum groove kicks in, it's got so much like grit to it that I think it really carries like a different vibe and energy from the previous record. But for me, the biggest improvement on this record is the vocalist all across this record just has so much snark and personality, and on Preachers that's absolutely right there from the get-go. She's got so much like I wouldn't say like range exactly, but she goes from kind of like these really snarky, borderline sarcastic lows to these impassioned shouts, a couple screams here and there. She sings across the record too. So she's got like a decent amount of dynamicism in her performance mainly, I would say. And yeah, you hear it all across this record. You've got the snarky kind of verses. The chorus on this track is absolutely killer. It really draws from that alt rock playbook. It's just kind of a banger of an opening track. Everything has like a good amount of forward momentum to it. It's punchy. It's catchy. It's the same track. It's the same. Sorry, not track length. Track length. It's the same length as all the other tracks on here, more or less. Everything here is essentially just like a 2.5 to 3.5 minute punk rock rager. So yeah, banger opening track, really, really enjoyed it. The next one, Feed My Fire, kind of reminds me of a punk rock Biffy Clyro, it's kind of like slightly odd rhythms and surprisingly sweet chorus. The track ends with this really manic stabbing section as well, with the vocals just going insane, following into an odd variation of the chorus that works really well thanks to the songwriting improvements, I think, in the band. And then after that, you get probably one of the best tracks on the record, maybe one of the best pro-choice anthems I think I've ever heard in my life. Baby I Had an Abortion is such an unbelievably good track. I can't stop listening to it. It's almost like an addiction at this point. It's ridiculous. But basically, the instrumentals are relatively stripped back for this one, and it's really the vocal performance that like carries it. The on the verses at the very least, the drums are essentially just playing like this snare hit with a kick pattern beneath it, but it's like a very, very basic bare thread one. And then the bass is just like generating this kind of like fuzz over the entire thing, and it's all about the incredibly sarcastic, snarky lyrics delivered with just so much kind of like, I don't even know what you'd call it, almost like sassy bitterness. It's really kind of unique, honestly, but it just works like incredibly well. And then the chorus, from what you would expect after listening to the verse, you wouldn't really, I don't think you would expect the chorus to be quite as sweet and dancey as it is, but it's got such a solid like 4/4 groove with the drums playing the hi-hats like in 16 notes essentially. The melody is like incredibly sweet and great as well. The like there's like, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's guitar or like some kind of electronic like programmed repeating thing, but the melody on the chorus, whatever lead instrument is playing that, it sounds great, and it's very like almost synth poppy in a way. It's shockingly dancey, but it works really, really well. It's a huge chorus, and it's such an odd juxtaposition with the grit of the verses that you almost imagine it wouldn't work, but once you hear it, it just does. It's just really good. I don't know how else to phrase it. The sing-along outro also works really well, was just a huge sing-along. And yeah, it's a massive highlight in the track listing. Definitely go listen to it, even if you don't listen to the record. It's a really, really solid track. The next track, Clowns, is probably the first moment where I was like, okay, this is just like a standard song for this record. But it's still like a very, very good song, essentially. It blends those alt-rock influences with the punk grit, has tons of personality. I love the soured guitars on the leads. The mathy, fast-paced chorus works really well. Also, just shout out to the drums on this section. On the second verse. There's this really creative drum grooving and fills on the second verse, especially like right at the front of it. They're almost like a linear groove, which is kind of like when you make a groove out of just playing one thing at a time, which I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone who isn't a drummer, but it sounds really cool. It works really well for the song. I also love the halftime outro. That's a really nice addition as well. And the songwriting, again, just it's nice and varied throughout, even though the kind of meat of the tracks never really changed that much. There's just nice variations all over the place that work really well to keep things fresh. Then the next song, Unsettle, this one starts out a little bit quieter than the other songs, and it's got a lot more singing. So it's a nice little break on the album, especially everything up to this point has just been so full on the entire time. It demonstrates how the band is able to make like a lot of small changes and grooves to keep the track interesting, like I was saying on Clowns, but it's really kind of like almost the highlight of this track, I guess, because I think a lot of the time when such an intense record takes a moment to be a bit quieter, it can often it's like a good thing to have in the track listing because you don't want it to be full on for the entire time. But at the same time, a lot of bands aren't as great at writing the quieter moments, and I would say that's definitely not the case here. I think Unsettle is a solid track in and of itself. It does have some fairly loud like choruses and stuff like that, but it's definitely a bit of a sweeter track in the listing. Not necessarily lyrically or anything, but you know, at least instrumentally. So that's a cool song. The next song, Fight for Our Lives, is essentially one of the darker and more urgent tracks, which makes a lot of sense following what it does. This one is largely driven by very bassy sounds, bordering on industrial noises to begin with, before exploding into this incredibly sweet, impassioned and pacey chorus. But even when the grittier verse comes back in, it just feels like even nastier second time round. And the vibe of this track makes a lot of sense because it's very much addressing gender injustice, specifically talking about the violence women face at the hands of men, whether that's on an individual or systemic level. It kind of addresses both. So it's definitely, again, a very just impassioned track that suits the kind of, just more gross instrumental, I suppose. Next song, Violent by Design, is kind of, for me, it was a little bit of a surprise in the track listing. It essentially, it sounds a lot like Rage Against the Machine with these sharper guitar noises backed by a drum roll. And then when the verse actually kicks in, the core groove has like that kind of funk rock styling you'd expect. It's still a bit more like punked up. It's not quite as like tight and funky as something like Rage would be. It's still got their fingerprint on it, for sure though. So basically, this anthem specifically addresses authority. Once again, the instrumentals are tight with a ton of energy, and it's another great track. But the vocals, once again, steal the show for sure. I really like some of the lyrics on this track too. Specifically towards the end, there's one that's like, oh god, I'm trying to remember. It's like, how many bad apples till we look at the tree? I think that's a really solid, effective way of kind of talking about the way that we all talk about and address authority, which is very appropriate with it being a Rage Against the Machine inspired track, or at least to my ear anyway. But yeah, I feel like that lyric's a simple, visual, and just very effective one to use. So yeah, another just great track. One or the other, the next track also has a pretty odd standout vibe, with the verses being fast and driven by a tom groove, while the guitars play a very like clear and loud melody. It's also actually the chorus on this one that slows down. I wouldn't say this one is like a real big standout or anything like that, but it's definitely another solid moment for sure. But that slight lull is fine because Sick and Tired is another huge highlight that comes essentially at the very, very end of the record. It lives up to its name with the whole song coming off incredibly bitter and urgent. The main guitar riff is incredibly sharp and harsh, almost slightly, like, I wouldn't say unnerving, but something moving, or uncomfortable, I guess, like moving in that direction, I guess. The drums and the bass do a great job of rooting everything in a pretty simple but effective groove. The vocals are incredibly desperate and impassioned on this song. The melodic section at the end of the track is amongst the most impactful on the record, perhaps just because of how uncomfortable a lot of the rest of the track is. So, yeah, just another brilliant display of songwriting with a ton of passion and just their signature sound all over it that kind of sticks out a little bit. It's very impactful. And then all of that leads us to the final track, Bones, which is the only one that breaks the kind of track length rule, I suppose you could say. This is the longest at 5 minutes and appropriately goes for the most melodic vibe on the whole record. It's a nice lyrical change as well, with it being more of a introspective song for the vocalist. It essentially goes over her personality cutting against what's expected of her life path. It's not like my favourite song on the record or anything, but it's a solid one for sure. I really like the lyrical angle, and it feels like a very appropriate lyrical angle considering it's, if you're going to make like a longer closing track, it makes sense to go for something slightly different. So yeah, I thought that was a really, really good direction to take it. There's many moments in the song that I really, really like. It's definitely not like a lull at all. It's just a very solid like closing song essentially. So yeah. That's the new record from Petrol Girls. I highly recommend it. I know I'm very, very late to this one, like I said. Go catch them live. I've seen them a decent number of times. They're incredible. I don't know what else to say. If you're into, like, punchy, aggressive, guitar-driven music, there's no reason not to check this record out. It's gonna be a highlight for the year for sure. There's just a shit ton of bangers on it, front to back. So yeah, go check it out. Cheers for listening. I'll hopefully see everyone around, alright? Peace out.